Tomyris. She ruled the Massagetai, a nomadic empire stretching across Central Asia, and she is on this list first because of what she did to the most powerful man in the world at the time. Cyrus the Great of Persia had conquered nearly everything he touched. He had toppled kingdoms, absorbed empires, and built a dominion so vast it seemed unstoppable. When he turned his attention toward Tomyris and her people, she warned him directly to turn back. He didn't. She assembled her forces, met his army in the field, and won. Cyrus died in that battle, which alone would make her remarkable, but what came next is what made her feared across generations. She reportedly had his severed head brought to her and submerged it in a vessel of blood, telling him he had spent his life thirsting for blood, and now he could drink his fill. Whether that detail is historically precise or embellished over centuries, the image it created was deliberate. She wanted the world to know exactly what kind of ruler she was. It worked. Olympias. She was the mother of Alexander the Great, and people who study that dynasty sometimes wonder whether Alexander inherited his ruthlessness from his campaigns or from watching her operate up close. When Philip II of Macedon was assassinated in 336 BC, suspicion fell partly on Olympias, though nothing was ever proven. What followed was more straightforward. She had Philip's other wife, Cleopatra of Macedon, and her infant daughter killed to eliminate any competing claim to the throne. When Alexander died and the empire began fracturing among his generals, Olympias re-entered Macedonian politics with the same energy she had always brought. She had a king murdered, she ordered executions, she accumulated enemies faster than allies, and eventually paid for it, captured and killed by those who had survived long enough to move against her. But the fear she generated throughout her life was entirely real. Even Alexander, who feared very little, reportedly said his mother charged a high rent for the 9 months he spent inside her. Athaliah. She ruled the kingdom of Judah for 6 years, and the way she came to power is one of the most startling sequences in ancient history. When her son, King Ahaziah, was killed, she looked at the situation, assessed who stood between her and the throne, and had the entire royal family executed. Her own grandchildren, every one of them, or so she believed, because one infant named Joash was smuggled out by a noose and hidden in the temple for years without her knowing. She ruled through absolute authority and religious imposition, replacing the worship of the God of Israel with Baal, which deepened the hostility against her. After 6 years, a priest named Jehoiada revealed the hidden child, orchestrated a coup, and had Athaliah executed. She went to her death shouting treason. The irony of that word coming from her mouth was apparently lost on no one present. Empress Irene of Byzantium. She was the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own name, and the way she achieved that is the part history doesn't soften. Her son, Constantine VI, was the legitimate emperor, and for years they shared power in an arrangement that grew increasingly tense. When Constantine moved to assert sole authority, Irene moved faster. In 797, she had him arrested and blinded on her orders, a punishment deliberately chosen because Byzantine law disqualified the blind from holding the throne. He survived the blinding but never ruled again. She then declared herself emperor, using the male title rather than empress, a signal that she considered herself fully in charge rather than a regent or consort. The theological politics of her reign were significant, and she is venerated as a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church for restoring the veneration of icons. The sainthood and the blinding of her son exist in the same biography, which says something about how complicated historical legacies tend to be. Isabella of France. She married Edward II of England as a teenager and spent years watching him humiliate her publicly, favoring male companions over her, stripping her of lands and income, and treating her as a political inconvenience. By the time she had had enough, she had also assembled the means to do something about it. She took a lover, Roger Mortimer, formed an alliance with exiled English nobles, raised an army in France, and invaded England in 1326. Edward's support collapsed almost immediately. He was captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, imprisoned, and died in Berkeley Castle under circumstances that historians still debate, though the most prominent accounts are not gentle. His closest favorites had already been executed. Isabella and Mortimer governed England as regents until her son, Edward III, was old enough and angry enough to move against them. Mortimer was executed, Isabella was placed under comfortable house arrest and lived another 28 years. The she-wolf of France, as she came to be called, had outlasted everyone who underestimated her. Catherine de' Medici. She came to France as a teenage bride from Florence, married into the French royal family, and spent years as a largely ignored queen consort, while her husband, Henry II, devoted his attention elsewhere. Then Henry died in a jousting accident. Her sickly son, Francis, became king. Francis died within a year, and suddenly Catherine was the mother of the king and the most powerful woman in France. She served as regent, navigated brutal religious wars between Catholics and Protestants that were tearing the country apart, and made decisions that haunted her reputation forever. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572 is the one history returns to most often, a night and the days that followed when thousands of Protestant Huguenots were killed across France after a royal wedding that had brought them to Paris in large numbers. The exact extent of her role in ordering or approving what happened is still debated by historians. What is not debated is that she was at the center of power when it occurred, and that the signal to begin came from the court she controlled. She outlasted 3 of her 4 sons who became kings of France, and died still trying to manage the chaos she had spent her life navigating. Brunhilde of Austrasia. She was a Visigoth princess who married into the Frankish royal family in the 6th century and spent the next 4 decades in a power struggle so relentless and so bloody that it is difficult to summarize without losing the full weight of it. Her husband was murdered. Her sister was strangled on orders from a rival queen named Fredegund. What followed was essentially a multi-decade war between Brunhilde and Fredegund that consumed 2 kingdoms, involved countless assassinations, executions, and political maneuvers, and outlasted both women in its consequences. Brunhilde managed kingdoms, raised armies, negotiated with popes, and outmaneuvered enemies for years. When she finally lost in 613, her end was spectacular in the worst sense. Accused of causing the deaths of 10 Frankish kings, she was tortured for 3 days, paraded on a camel through the army that had captured her, and then tied to 4 horses that were driven in different directions. She was in her 60s. The men who ordered that death were afraid of what she represented even after they had won. Anna of Russia. She became Empress of Russia in 1730 under circumstances that initially suggested her power would be limited by a council of nobles who thought they could control her. She dissolved that arrangement within weeks of taking the throne and spent the next decade making sure no one forgot who was in charge. Her instrument of control was the secret chancellery, a political police operation that investigated, arrested, tortured, and exiled anyone suspected of disloyalty or sedition. Estimates suggest around 20,000 people were sent to Siberia during her 10-year reign. Public denunciations were encouraged, which meant neighbors reported neighbors and servants reported masters, and the atmosphere of suspicion became self-sustaining. Her court was simultaneously one of the most extravagant in Europe, full of elaborate entertainments and imported luxury, and one of the most dangerous places to say the wrong thing. The contrast between the spectacle and the surveillance underneath it was not accidental, it was the point. Blanche of Castile. She was the daughter of a Spanish king and the granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, which meant she came from exceptional stock, and she governed France twice as regent with a grip that surprised everyone who assumed a woman in that position would be manageable. The first time was during the minority of her son, Louis IX, who would later become Saint Louis. She faced immediate rebellions from nobles who saw a regency as an opportunity and crushed them with a combination of military force and political skill that left little room for a second attempt. She negotiated, she threatened, she moved armies, and she made it consistently clear that the throne she was protecting was not available. The second regency came when Louis went on crusade, and she governed France in his absence for years with the same steadiness. She is one of the most effective regents in French history and one of the least celebrated, possibly because effectiveness in a woman was more complicated to memorize than ruthlessness. Empress Dowager Cixi. She entered the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine and left it 5 decades later, having outlasted everyone who ever tried to move against her. The mechanics of how she accumulated power have been described earlier in this series, but what belongs here specifically is the atmosphere she created. Information was controlled, access to the emperor was controlled. Officials who fell out of favor disappeared from prominence with a speed and completeness that kept everyone else perpetually uncertain about their own position. The Guangxu emperor, her nephew, whom she had placed on the throne, spent the last decade of his life under effective house arrest after he attempted reforms she had not approved. He died in 1908, 1 day before she did, of arsenic poisoning, according to modern forensic analysis. She had ruled China through fear for so long that even her death carried the fingerprints of deliberate control.